Hey everyone, Wiley Beckert here. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the ink painting process for my latest playing card illustration. If you want more details on the tools and techniques I'm using here, I publish step-by-step process tutorials for my supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/WileyBeckert. The theme of this particular card is pride, and the concept for this piece is a sculptor who is falling in love with a statue of himself. As with most of my paintings, I'm starting out with a finished drawing before moving on to the inks. I tend to be a draftsman more than a painter, and I just find it easier to build an image in pencil rather than jumping right into the painting. What you're seeing here is my underdrawing on watercolor paper, and I'm actually working over a low opacity printout of my initial rough sketch, which the camera has a bit of a tough time capturing the difference between the print and the final pencil lines, but in reality there is a pretty dramatic change going on from one to the other. The printout is light enough that it won't be showing through the layers of ink that I'm going to add later. It's just dark enough to help guide where I'm putting the pencil lines at this stage. This is one of those steps that at first glance you might wonder why I'm not just painting over my rough sketch to begin with. But for me, this is sort of the best way to end up with a nice clean final image without having to be too cautious at the sketch stage. I'm not going to have to worry about trashing my surface by erasing too much or stray pencil marks showing through in the wrong places. Plus, it gives me a chance to sort of rehearse all of my pencil strokes before I commit to them in the final. So it's a little bit repetitive, but I really like the end results. I'm starting off the painting with a really thin wash of ink, just to knock back the white of the paper a bit, since my overall value structure is going to be quite dark. You can see that I've masked off that narrow border in the image with masking fluid, since I want that to stay a bit lighter, but everything else is good to go. I don't have to seal the pencil drawing with anything because I've used a fairly hard pencil and a textured paper that really grabs onto the graphite well and prevents smudging. Plus, any sort of sealant at this stage will affect how the ink goes down, which I definitely want to avoid. You can see how thin the washes I'm using are here. I'm going for a really gradual buildup of values just to keep everything really subtle and controlled. Here I'm adding another overall wash to take everything a little bit darker, but I'm also dabbing up some of the ink with a paper towel just to make sure that I'm not losing those light values. This is a little bit of a boring step, but I'm building up the values of the border just to help me judge how dark I'm going on those interior values. Building up one major area to its final value like this gives me something solid to compare the rest of my values to. I can look at my value study and say, okay, the skin is lighter than the border value, the clothes are darker than the border value. It's just a lot better than trying to figure these things out blind. I'm making sure to keep my values really light on the statue, since that pale tone is going to be one of the things that really sets it apart from the living character. But at the same time, I need dark enough values in there that there's going to be some interesting contrast and a sense of depth and shadow, so it's a bit of a balancing act. And you can tell I'm taking it really slowly and trying to build up the darker surrounding values as much as possible, just to give me something to compare to. Once I've got those very darkest values in the corners built up, it's just a matter of building up the rest of the values to work with them. That initial ink wash I put down in the beginning is actually starting to look a lot lighter alongside the dark values than it did initially. So that's essentially become my white for the piece at this stage. I'm leaving small areas of that lighter value untouched, pretty much anywhere that I want to indicate a strong light hitting the figure. You can kind of tell by looking at the drawing in this piece that I like to think of the figures in terms of flat planes wrapping around the three-dimensional forms. So for something like an arm, I'll always think of that as more of a rectangular prism than as a cylinder. And that sort of thinking is a big help when you're figuring out where the light and shadow in your piece will fall. Obviously, it does help to take some reference photos with an approximation of your lighting setup before you start, but even then you sometimes end up with some areas of confusing information. So it's helpful to have this planar model of the figure in your head just to help guide your lighting decisions. The effect of all these thin ink washes layered on top of each other is really soft and subtle, which is generally a good thing. But I actually like to have a bit more sharpness in my work, especially when there's line art involved. So at this point I'm switching back to pencils, going over some of the lines that have started to fade a little, and also taking the opportunity to add some really controlled shading, especially in the faces, where I usually feel like ink work can be a little risky because of how easy it is to go too dark or to create too hard of an edge. You'll notice that I'm not really revisiting too many of the lines on the interior of the figures, because in areas without a ton of detail, those softer transitions between values are actually a good thing. I'm mostly focusing on the outlines and the hard-edge details like facial features. I'm also adding in some additional details at this stage. Here you can see I'm putting in some veins of darker stone in the statue to sort of sell that carved marble effect. I really like the flexibility of pencil for this. It's good to be able to put down details, rework them, erase them a little bit, just to kind of try out what's going to work in a given area. I also use colored pencil, generally a darker gray, an indigo, or a black, depending on the situation. Anywhere that I need a darker value than a graphite pencil can give me, especially working over an area where two dark objects are overlapping, a graphite line just won't be dark enough to stand out. So I kind of mix and match tools as much as I need to get the look I'm going for. Highlights are one of those things that really adds a lot of polish to an image and makes it feel finished very quickly. And for that reason, it can be tempting to go overboard with them and just put them all over everything, which tends to take away their impact and can also kill the realism of a piece. So for that reason, I like to pretty much save the highlights for last. I don't bring in the white charcoal pencil until I've already gotten all of my darker values and midtones established. And I try really hard to not add those pure whites to any part of the piece that I haven't already left as a very light value, unless there's a good reason to do so. On shinier surfaces like metal, you're likelier to see a pure white highlight next to a dark area, but in general, it's better to hold back with this. This whole process is a little bit of a slow build, but the plus side of that is that by the end of the piece, it really doesn't take too much to wrap it all up. These playing cards are going to be fairly monochromatic, so I'm just adding some really thin layers of watercolor for a little bit of temperature variation within the piece, some sort of greenish bronze tones for metal and cloth, and a really diluted red to add warmth to the character's skin, just to help set him apart even further from the statue. The ink wash gives me a pretty dark base to work on top of, so I'm not going to get really vivid colors at this stage. If I actually needed to go any brighter, this would be a good chance to use something more opaque like acrylic ink, but the transparency of watercolor actually works great for what I'm doing here. I like to do one final pass after the watercolor stage, just to touch up the pencil line art anywhere that needs it, and add a few final details in white charcoal. Even though I'm working with a whole bunch of different media in this process, the great thing is how well all of the tools work together. You can really switch back and forth between them as much as you need, and just keep making little changes and adjustments right up until the end. And with that, the painting is finished. If you enjoyed this video, you can find more tutorial content on Patreon at patreon.com/WileyBeckert. And the support of my patrons does help keep these videos coming, so thank you guys so much.